Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, and today I am going to be doing my part 1 of a Fashionista Queen of Hearts costume. And I am so happy to finally say that this video is up. It has definitely been a journey making this whole thing, and I've been so unmotivated to complete it, and now that it's finally done, I am so happy and so thrilled that I can finally post this up for you guys. But it is a long adventure with this one, so I am breaking it up into 2 parts. I am mostly going to be focusing on all the components to putting this whole thing together, and then I'll start a little bit of the assembly, mostly in the bodice. So I just want you to know that there is a lot of information going on in this video, and take your time. If you need to pause, go ahead and pause the video so you can look at the information a little more. I really tried my best to not be too confusing, but like I said, there's just a lot of information going on. So hopefully at some point it'll make sense to you. But I definitely tried my best. I used 3 different patterns. The main pattern that I used was the McCalls 7641, and that's for most of the whole jacket dress part of the outfit. And then I used the Kwik for the under bodysuit, catsuit, yellow and black and white striped deal going on underneath. And then I used the Simplicity 2172, and I just used it for the sleeve flange, and that was the only pattern piece I took away from that, which in the end I think you could use another one of the sleeve head, and if you just do a little adjustments, that way you don't, if you don't have this pattern, you don't have to pick up a whole new pattern just to do this one. So that's up to you, but I had it, so I decided to use it, and I really wanted that look on the sleeve. So going forward here, we're just going to start cutting out all the pieces basically. So right now I'm just displaying all of the amounts of pieces you need for each that you're going to be cutting out, and then I'm going to start going into how I modified everything. So I really tried to include every bit of the modifications that I did. So we're gonna start with the front bodice piece, and I'm gonna cut off this whole triangle part right here. I don't want any of it. I just want a nice smooth edge. I don't want any of that color. So I'm just gonna draw a line from one corner to the other right before that triangle starts. And basically you can draw a straight line, which I do later on. Then I'm going to add my modification of the white strip that I'm adding, and I'm going to line this out at a 2-inch width, and it's just going to be on the opening of the front bodice, and I'm just going to draw this all the way down using the edges of the bodice as my guide. Going to the skirt back, I'm going to do the same 2-inch border going along the bottom of the skirt only. So same thing, just a 2-inch strip following that bottom edge all the way across. Now I'm just marking the patterns right now. I'm not cutting anything off yet. So just be aware of that if you're following along with the video. Then for the skirt front, I'm also going to do a 2-inch strip around that front opening edge. I had modified this little curve originally, but I didn't like it, so I went back to the normal curve. So just ignore the fact that I'm making a different curve than the pattern is right now. I did go back and switch it back to the original. And this one you're gonna go along the bottom edge as well. I did mess up this little portion a bit, which you'll see later on, and then I fix it. So if you're following along, just know that my little mess up might change a little later on. So I have my front bodice piece cut out like normal in the lining. So these are my 2 lining pieces, and I haven't cut anything off yet. It's my just regular pattern piece. And same thing with the skirt front. I'm doing the same pattern piece shape, and I'm doing opposite colors for my lining, so I'm cutting them out with right sides together. For my skirt back, same thing. It's going to be my normal pattern piece. Now I want my red heart fabric and my black swirl fabric to contrast with my lining. So I'm going to make sure that when I cut them out that I have them right sides together so that they're opposite pieces when I cut them out, so that way they line up when I go to sew them together later on. So for the skirt back, I've cut out my main fabric now. I have cut off the extra 2-inch little border that I've added, and instead I've added a 5/8 inch seam allowance to help sew on that white piece later on. And same thing on the skirt front piece on both the front edge and the bottom. For the sleeve, I just shortened the sleeve to the length that I wanted, making sure to add a 5/8 inch seam allowance. And then keep in mind I am also adding a sleeve band, so I'm lengthening to that, to where I want the sleeve band to hit. For the back bodice, cutout is normal. And then for the front bodice, I also cut off that 2-inch border and added a 5/8 inch seam allowance. For the sleeve flange, you want to cut out 4, making sure that you have each pieces facing right sides together. And then I have my sleeve band, which I have 1 of each. My sleeve head is normal, I cut out in my lining. My undercollar is in my white fabric, that's a normal piece. The collar band is also a normal piece in my white fabric. The upper collar is also a normal piece in my white fabric, so no modifications for those. For my front bodice trim, I've also added a 5/8 inch seam allowance to that inner edge, so that we can sew them together later on. And same thing with the skirt front trim. See, this is where I messed up. These I will show how to fix later on, but these are essentially going to be 2 pieces. The same thing, you want to add the 5/8 inch seam allowance to the inner edge. And here's my skirt back trim for the bottom of the skirt with my 5/8 inch seam allowance. And then for my catsuit, I have my front, and I've just modified the length, which you can do on the pattern piece as normal, which I wish I left a little longer because it was a little shorter than I wanted. And same thing with the back, you want to make sure you get the same length in there as well. So I definitely took some time to cut these out because I really wanted that slanted look, and I didn't achieve what I really wanted. I think it would have been best to cut out each piece individually, and you would use the grain to line everything up, but it definitely took a while, so I would recommend taking your time when cutting these pieces out if you're doing this exact sort of look. And then I didn't match the stripes. I accidentally cut it out to where they lined up. But that's alright, we all make mistakes. I still love how it came out. And then once all your pattern pieces are done, you're going to mark all your dots and cut all of your notches. So starting with the front back bodice, I'm going to sew in my darts. So taking a sewing needle, I'm going to go through the bottom 2 dots. I'm going to pinch up at the inner top dot to make that folded crease. And I will pin down this crease in a triangular shape. Do this to all your darts, and then you're going to sew them down in that angle. Iron all of your seam allowance of the darts toward the center. For the skirt front, I'm showing this now, but I will fix this later. So I'm going to line up this front edge, and this should actually be backwards. I didn't realize I sewed this on funny, which is why it probably didn't work out correctly. I had a lot of frustrations with this part, definitely. But for now, you can see I'm adding the bottom section. The bottom section will be separated later on. But when you place these white sections down, they should be backwards actually. So I'm going to sew these on at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. And for the bottom of the skirt back, I'm doing it correctly. See how it's an awkward angle, and I'm kind of angling it out. This is kind of what I should have done with the other one. So it shouldn't fit perfectly. It should actually be a little awkward to line up. But I'm going to pin this edge down all the way across. So see, when I fold it down, it'll look correct. So do this to both of your pieces. And sew these with the 5/8 inch seam allowance. For the front bodice, I'm going to take that white strip, and same thing, you want to do right sides together with the wrong funky side. So it should be a little awkward, but if you just maneuver the fabric a little bit and pin close together, you can work the fabric into the direction that you want. Hopefully you can kind of see what I'm doing so you can match that up yourself if you're doing this modification. Otherwise it's very hard to describe. And do this to the other front bodice as well. Same thing, you do not want the edges to line up perfectly. You want the opposite edge lined up. So sew these on at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. And for all these seam allowances, I'm going to cut off half of the seam allowance just to get rid of all the bulk of the extra fabric. And then you're going to iron all of the seam allowance up in toward your main fabric. That way it doesn't show through the white. So this is what I mean by how I mess up. So I'm going to go from this mess up because I want it laying outward, not inward. And I want it to look like this. So I'm going to show you how I fix that. So I'm going to take my seam ripper and I'm basically going to take off this whole bottom section on the skirt. So now that it's opened, I'm going to take my scissors and I'm going to cut off that bottom skirt edge. So that bottom skirt edge, I'm just going to recut out a new piece, and I want it to go from that whole length of the bottom of the skirt piece, from corner to corner. So I already cut off my seam allowance. I'm just going to cut the same width of my strip, but if you do this in the right time, you can do the same piece with the 5/8 inch seam allowance like it was. So here I've sewed this on right sides together, making sure it's that opposite shape. I'm going to cut off any excess fabric I may have. And from here, this is how it should look. And we are now on the right track. So going to my front bodice pieces, I'm going to take my back bodice pieces and lay them right sides together, matching my same colors. I'm going to pin up the shoulders and the sides on both pieces. I will sew these at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Opening these up, I'm going to lay these right sides together, matching up that back center seam. Then I'm going to sew this at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. I'm going to iron my back center seam and my side seams open. And then the shoulder seams, I'm going to iron them both toward the center. This will matter later on when we sew on the collar. Going to the neckline, I'm going to do a base stitch at a 5/8 inch seam allowance between the two dots. And this will be like a stay stitch basically to prevent stretching and warping. For all of my collar pieces, I'm going to add the interfacing onto the back side of each piece, ironing them on. So taking my upper and my under collar, I'm going to lay these right sides together. And I'm going to pin up the outside edges. I will sew these outside edges at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. I'm going to trim off some of the corners to get rid of any excess fabric. And I will turn this right side out, making sure my little corners are poked out nice and sharp. Fold out the edges so it lays perfectly, and then iron this all in place. Top stitch the outside edge at a 1/8 inch seam allowance. And I'm also going to do a base stitch of a 5/8 inch seam allowance along the neck edge. So you can see here what that'll look like. Taking one side, laying it right sides together of my collar band, I'm going to match up my dots with the edges of the upper collar and pin up that raw edge with the neckline edge. Then I'm going to flip it over, and same thing with the other collar band piece. I'm going to lay it right sides together, basically lining it up with the opposite side so the upper and under collar are sandwiched in between. Fold in the edge of the upper under collar so that you can lay those edges of the collar band together and pin them up. That way the upper and under is out of the way, so you're not sewing them in. And then we're going to sew these edges at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Trim off your excess corners and the excess seam allowance. I'm going to place a few small clips into the seam allowance just before the thread where the curve is, just so that it lays nice and neat when we fold this out. Line this out as neatly as you can, and then go ahead and press it in place. Base stitch the bottom edge at a 5/8 inch seam allowance, and once again you will top stitch the upper edges at a 1/8 inch seam allowance. Going to our neckline on our bodice, lay your collar right sides together, matching up the center seams and the dots with the edge of the collar band. Then line up the rest of the neckline, pinning it in place. And we're going to sew this on at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. So this is what it'll look like. Taking our sleeve flanges, I'm going to lay them right sides together, matching my same colors together. And I'm going to sew that long bottom edge at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. I'm going to place clips or small triangles into the curves of this, so once again when I turn this out, it should fold out a little more neatly. I'm going to make sure that everything's folded out the way I want, and then I will press it in place with right sides out. I'm going to top stitch a 1/8 inch seam allowance along that long bottom edge, and then a base stitch along that top curve. For the sleeve head, I'm going to fold each in half to match up the curves, and I will pin up that open edge. Sew these together with a gathering base stitch. Taking my sleeve band, I'm going to lay opposite colors right sides together, matching up the bottom edges of my sleeves. I'm going to sew these on at a 3/8 inch seam allowance. And then I will do a gathering base stitch along the top curve between the small dots. Iron the seam allowance of the sleeve band toward the sleeve. Fold the sleeve band in half with wrong sides together, and I'm just going to press in the crease. Do this to both sleeves. Taking my sleeve, I'm going to fold those edges right sides together and pin them in place on both sleeves, making sure that the sleeve band is opened up. Sew these edges at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Iron open these seams. And this concludes part 1 of my Fashionista Queen of Hearts costume. So like I said, there's a lot going on. I hope that you have kept up thus far. I think this is the more harder section of the project itself. So if you can get past all of the cutting out of the pieces and all of the modifications, this second part should definitely be a breeze. So please stay tuned for part 2. It should be up shortly. So make sure that you are subscribed and you hit the bell so that you get notified when that video goes live, so we can continue on with the assembly. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in part 2. Bye!